Have you ever noticed something going on in your dental practice that you think, oh, I must address this? Only in that moment, you decide not to, perhaps because you don't accept someone. And instead you think, well, I'll do it later, but actually you never do. Creating a culture of feedback is just so important for a dental practice. And as a leader, creating that culture is your responsibility. In this video, I'm going to help you figure out how to actually do that and how to create a culture of feedback in your dental practice. Why is it so important to create a culture of feedback? Well, it may seem fairly obvious, which is that if we can't give feedback and have this culture of feedback in the practice, you can't continually improve and get better and better. And if you can't do that, then actually what happens is you start to stagnate and actually you'll go backwards because when things aren't up to standard, then nothing will be said. And actually, so your standards will drop. There are a few other reasons, though, as to why it's so important to have a culture of feedback. And they are, firstly, it prevents resentment buildup. And what I mean by that is if we don't say and give feedback to people when we notice things, often it can build up because we see it again, see it again, see it again. And then that leads to actually destructive conflict, because then when we've eventually had enough, we're not in a great state to be able to talk to the other person constructively and give that feedback. And it blows up into this big kind of argument, which is destructive conflict. So we want this really constructive conflict with great feedback, and that can help create that culture that we really want. Alongside that, it also means we create this open and honest culture where people give feedback openly and honestly. And then finally, it creates energy and enthusiasm. If we give good feedback, not just bad feedback, which in its own right can create motivation, but also if we give positive feedback, that can be really motivating and inspiring for people if done in the right way. So lots of really good reasons as to why creating a culture of feedback is so important for your dental practice. Now, there are two sides to this coin, don't know how to do a coin, which is in order to be able to give feedback, you have to be able to receive feedback. So in order to be able to give feedback, you have to be able to receive feedback well. If you don't receive feedback well, how can you expect your team members to receive feedback well when you're giving them feedback? So it really starts with you being able to receive feedback effectively. When it comes to receiving feedback, there's some important things to remember. Firstly, remember that the only way we can improve is to get feedback. And if this really sticks with us, this can help us think about the value that they're getting from the feedback. Second thing, which I think is perhaps not what people feel, is that you don't have to act on the feedback. You go, what? Yeah, you don't have to act on it, but what you do have to do from my side is to actually really listen and understand what the other person is saying. So if we just think that I owe it to the other person to really listen and understand exactly what they're saying, and then I can make a decision about ultimately what I want to do with that feedback, and I can communicate that back to the person as to what I'm going to do with it. Ultimately, if you think that, then it can help us actually respond well to feedback, because I think sometimes the reason we don't respond to feedback is we think we've got to do something with it, and we don't. We actually have that choice always to ourselves, as the other person does when you give them feedback. But if you receive it and understand it well, that can help you then give feedback, to take the feedback and then decide what you want to do with it. And then thirdly, when you receive feedback, the third point I want to make about receiving feedback is to come up with some kind of holding statement. So firstly, be aware when you think someone's trying to give you feedback, to just think of a holding statement such as, I'm sensing or feeling that you're giving me some feedback, and I genuinely really want to understand the feedback. So can you just say that again? Describe it a bit more. Give me some examples. That'd be really helpful so that I can understand the feedback. Okay. So really listen, ask, delve in more, find out more what the feedback is, and then you can decide what your perspective is on that feedback and engage in dialogue. All right. So first thing is to actually be able to receive feedback yourself. When you can receive feedback and effectively, that encourages other people to do and receive feedback in the same way. When it comes to then giving feedback, there are a few principles about giving feedback that I want to give to you. Firstly, clear is kind, unclear is unkind. So clear is kind, unclear, with lots of different words gabbling on like this, is unkind. I have people who I talk to about, who I've spoken to about feedback, and they will say, well, people say I'm too blunt. And so I'm going to add some more words. I'm like, really? Actually, that's not the answer for me. I think when people say give feedback that's too blunt, it's probably a bit around your tone and intent of the feedback. And this is really important. It's not around more words. So clear is kind, short, articulated, very clear words as to what you're trying to say, but then with an appropriate tone, an empathetic tone, and also intent. Other principles are make sure you can clearly articulate the behavior. If you can't describe and articulate it very clearly, you're not going to be able to articulate it to the other person. Know your boundaries. What are the things that are really important so you know when you need to speak to somebody about something that's really important and what you've seen. Do as soon as possible after the event. So do as soon as possible after the event. Waiting for a long time is not helpful. So give the feedback as soon as possible after the event itself has actually happened. Now, there are situations where maybe it's really blown up and there's some really high emotion, in which case you obviously, it's not sensible to do it at that moment, but don't leave it for 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, a week, whatever. It's all forgotten about by then. So if you need to leave it for an hour or two for things to cool down, that's okay. But do it as soon as possible after the event. And finally, just make sure that you're in a place that's private when you're giving feedback on an individual level. So these are some principles. And then when it comes to the structure of the conversation, I really want to stress one thing in particular, which is you want to give feedback that's about the situation and what happened. And you want to avoid saying to people, you always do this or you never do that, because that becomes an attack on the whole person, right? And we're not saying that we're not going to have emotion in these conversations. We are, and they can get difficult. But what we don't want is a really strong fight or flight response, because then you can't engage in dialogue and work out a constructive way forward. So with this in mind, the structure of the conversation has a few steps for me. The first one is ask for permission. Ask for permission to give the feedback. And that's a genuine question. If they say, no, I'm not in a place to have it right now, that's okay. When would be a good time to speak to you about it? So that's for ask for permission. Second thing is describe, articulate, talk about what you've noticed and what you've observed. So what I noticed the other day was how brilliantly you spoke to that patient. Or what I noticed the other day was, well, the way you spoke to that patient was quite aggressive and wasn't very empathetic. What I've noticed over the last week is that you've been late 3 times on 3 separate occasions by 10 minutes each. So you're describing the situation, what you've noticed and what you've not observed. You're not saying I'm always late or you always talk to patients that way, you'll never climb with patients. No, you're talking about what you've observed and what you've noticed. It's really quite factual. And then once you've done that, you talk about the impact of that behavior. So the way you spoke to that patient means they may not come back again. to the practice because they won't feel comfortable. Because when you're late, the impact of that is we get behind as a whole clinic, and that makes it very difficult for everybody in the clinic. And then there's a level of stress which comes across to patients. So you ask for permission, what you noticed, what you've observed, and then the impact of that. And the fourth step is you open up for dialogue. Ask them what their take is on this and get their perspective. Really explore perhaps why this isn't happening, why it is happening. Just really get into conversation, ask lots of questions to figure out how you can move that forward. And that's the next step, which is how do we actually move this forward from here? Really agree very clearly steps forward to move it from there. And you may well be thinking, well, yeah, then I'll tell them what the steps are, what they need to do. You don't necessarily. You can ask them for the way they want to move it forward so they address it themselves, so they take ownership of it. So how can we move it forward so you're not going to be late in the coming weeks? How can we change that so you speak to patients in a more appropriate way? This is all up after having that dialogue, which may have given you some very clear ways forward anyhow. So permission, what you've noticed, what you've observed, impact, dialogue, and then way forward. And when you talk about the way forward, make sure you agree a follow-up date. So they know this isn't just a conversation that's just, oh, we've had a kind of, doesn't really matter. No, it does matter. And there's a date in the diary when we're going to review this and check in with how you've got on and how you've been doing. The follow-up piece is really important. And really at that stage also, after the conversation, then you've got to look out for the behavior, both look out for it in a positive way. So has the behavior changed? Are you seeing a difference? And when you see that difference, really recognize that. We will typically be looking still for what we saw before because that's what we expect. That's what our brain will be saying, oh, they still be doing that. But actually, you have to really look out for the new behavior. And when you see it, recognize and encourage it. And obviously, if it's still a problem, you have to come back to it and revisit it at that follow-up meeting. But you have to keep the steps and the next steps and the follow-up so you know and the person knows you're serious about wanting to see a change in behavior. Now, the next point I want to talk about is about balance. How do we find the balance when it comes to giving feedback? You've heard me talk about some positive and some negative, and then you would have heard different things, I'm sure, about how you say something nice, say something bad, and say something nice. That was the original certain kind of sandwich, which I won't say here. And now a lot of people I hear say you need to say lots of nice things and then give the bad feedback to keep the balance. Now, from my side, I actually don't agree with that. If you say all the nice stuff and then say the bad stuff, does anybody remember the nice stuff, the good stuff? No, they don't. They just go, oh, here comes the other foot. And then all they think about is the bad. And all they take on board is the bad. Yes, we have to create balance and lots of positive feedback. But we do that by giving the same type of feedback as and when the positive stuff happens. And then as and when the bad stuff happens. So you see something really great about what a person's done in your dental practice, you pull them aside and say, can I have a word? And typically, most people will be thinking, oh, I'm in trouble here. And actually, you just give them some really positive feedback in exactly the same structure. What I noticed was how you spoke to that person was absolutely fantastic. That patient was absolutely fantastic. And that means they're likely to really come back to the practice time and time again, the impact. And they'll be like, is that it? You'll be like, yeah, that's it. And then when something again happens, again, pull them aside and hopefully then lots of positive situations, but then when you see a negative situation, you can also talk to them about that. So give the feedback as and when it happens, looking for the positive. So you get the balance that way, not by putting a load of positive stuff in at the beginning to soften them up when you've noticed something bad. It's not the way to do it, because then people just forget. So you're being very clear to the point each time. All right. So that to me is how you create the balance. And then my final point is around overall culture, is that we want this feedback to be going in all directions, from the practice manager to the associates, from the principal to the practice manager to the nurse, from the nurse to the principal. Yes, yes, all those directions. And from nurse to nurse, associate to associate. Because if we all do, if everybody does that in your practice, that's when you have the culture of it's just giving feedback. That is part of the culture of how we do things within this practice. Okay, I hope that makes sense. So, as a short summary, the impact of creating a culture in your practice, a culture of feedback on your practice dental practice, really significant. It's worth really focusing on this and getting expert at giving feedback and receiving feedback, as I've talked about, because you have to be able to receive it in order to give it. When was the last time you asked for some feedback about you, not about the practice, but about you? And then when you're giving the feedback, just remember, talk about what you've observed and what you've noticed and the impact of that. So what are the conversations you need to have? What feedback do you need to give people? Really enjoy creating this culture of feedback, because it will really help your dental practice move forward.